Okay, we are in Genesis chapter 22, beginning in verse 22 this evening. So, this is after the birth, weaning of Isaac, and the dismissal, I guess you could say, of Ishmael from the family camp there. So Genesis 21 and verse 22. 22. Now it came about at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my offspring, or with my posterity, but according to the kindness that I have shown you, you shall show to me, and to the land in which you have sojourned. Abraham said, I swear it. But Abraham complained to Abimelech because of the well of water which the servants of Abimelech had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor did I hear of it until today. Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. Then Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of a flock by themselves. Abimelech said to Abraham, what do these 7 ewe lambs mean, which you have set by themselves? He said, you shall take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that it may be a witness to me that I dug this well. Therefore he called the place Beersheba, because there the two of them took an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba, and Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, arose and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines for many days. Okay. Nell says hi. Hi, Nell. What do we think about this passage?
Abraham's reputation preceded him. Abimelech says, don't deal with me falsely. Tell me the truth.
Reputation and experience in the case of Abimelech. Yeah. I mean, he'd been dealt falsely by Abraham before, and doesn't want it to happen again. One of the distinctive characteristics of Abraham and his immediate family, his close descendants and all that, was that they dug wells. And so they allowed them to live in areas where maybe other peoples who weren't so inclined would not live. And it would allow his descendants to live in a place in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, where the Egyptians did not frequent, because they stayed near the Nile. That was where they got their water. So this is a part of the story here. We have Beersheba, which is an important kind of landmark in the nation of Israel. You've probably heard the phrase or seen the phrase as you read scripture, from Dan to Beersheba. It's kind of like saying from coast to coast in the United States. If you know kind of the basic layout of Israel, it's kind of a relative, especially when you count just west of the Jordan, it's a relatively narrow, vertically shaped, north to south more than east to west, boundaried country. And so they would, whereas the United States is kind of more horizontal of a rectangle, and we look at coast to coast, they would look Dan, which is the northern part of their territory, to Beersheba, which is the southern part. And this is kind of like the frontier. Beersheba is the last outpost before you really get into the influence of the Egyptian Empire. So it's an important point. It's important because there's water there where there might not have been otherwise, but there's also this political boundary, and it served as an outpost and defining line, really the southern border of what would become Israel. Has anybody in here seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia?
Just saw it the other night.
You did? It's not a short movie, is it? It was not nominated for Best Short Film.
Oh.
It's a lengthy film. One of my
But they protected their well. I guess
they were Arabs, not Jews,
Yeah.
but Lawrence and his guide, which is one type of Arab, stop at a well owned by another type of Arab, and from a long distance they see a rider coming on a camel, and then as soon as the rider is kind of somewhat discernible, the Arab guide for Lawrence tries to take off running, and before he can get anywhere, a rifle shot drops him like a bad habit. And when it finally shows up, Omar Sharif has made his appearance into the film. He's the camel riding Arab in that scene, and he knew he couldn't drink from that well. That's you're welcome to. Lawrence finds out you can drink from it. He couldn't, and so wells were protected. It required a lot of investment in labor, and it was a very valuable commodity. If you don't think water is valuable, I think everybody around here knows how valuable water is. In Western Washington, they kind of take it for granted. We got more water than we know what to do with over here sometimes. But water was in a desert area. They value it very highly. And Abraham has made a major investment, and it's being interfered with by Abimelech's people. Abraham didn't disclose this beforehand, but it sounds like it's going to be rectified. Abimelech's going to respect that investment that Abraham has made that brings about Beersheba. That's probably something along the lines of a well of Oz, and it's going to be an important point in the history of the nation of Israel as long as it exists. So that's part of what's going on here. Any other thoughts on this reading?
It's interesting that he gave them 7 ewe lambs. 7 is a number, what is that, a complete number? Basically.
Mm-hmm. And 7 ewe lambs can lead to a whole bunch of other lambs too, can't
Well,
it?
he evidently gave them cattle and sheep both, and then for some reason or other, he gave them 7 lambs to Abimelech. Maybe it was just to Abimelech himself, or whatever. But the term 7 is kind of the perfect number.
Abraham is buying his right to inhabit. This is a covenant, and one of the first things you learn in law school is that a contract always has an exchange in some way, not just agreement, not just a promise, but mutually beneficial. You get something, but you have to give up something, and both sides on that regard. So you go buy a car, you give them money, they give you a car. That's a contract, and usually most of us have to pay it out over time. So you have a whole lot of other paperwork to sign and all of that. But it's an ongoing relationship, true. It is more than a contract, but it is a contract. And for a contract to exist, there has to be an exchange. It can't just be can't be a one-sided, I'm getting something and not giving anything up. And we see some really interesting, more interesting, I think, than this, but interesting negotiations at times when they try to buy land and all that as we go forward. Kind of some very ceremonial, formal, and kind of sometimes they act like, well, we don't really need anything for it. They don't want to act like, money. They kind of act like money's beneath them. Wealth is beneath. It was kind of like a little bit when you were a kid growing up and you went to church or I went to a dinner after church with other families, maybe one or two families, and the dad started fighting over who had to pay the check for the whole group and everything. And if your dad was really smart, he would put up a pretty good fight, but know right when to quit and let the other dad take it. That's the art of the deal there. Since I'm not a dad, I haven't figured that out yet. But that's the smartest deal you possibly can do. You make it look like you really were ready to and wanted to pay for everybody, and then let somebody pay for not only their family, but yours too. So that's a really good deal. But in reality, the whole thing, it's never going to be free. They know all along that there's going to be the payment is involved, and they don't expect it either way to be free. And these are wealthy men. Abimelech has got an army and a general, so he's a wealthy man. Abraham's a wealthy man, and this is a fair, more or less arm's length transaction with some history to it. The people know each other a little bit. So, anything else? Well, it also shows that Abraham's treatment of other people does not automatically flow from his relationship with God. He's God's chosen man, but it's also important how he chooses to treat other people. The fact that he is in a relationship with God does not mean he's really a good neighbor inherently. It doesn't just automatically happen.
It should, but it doesn't.
It should when you really understand. Now, he has, in a sense, been a really good neighbor already. He was a good neighbor to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Not to any effect, but he tried. And so it's not that he's a bad neighbor necessarily, but it takes intention. It's still a matter of choice. It's still a matter of appreciating certainly your relationship with God, that he's blessed you, but it's also, it is easy to be a person of God, to feel like you're a faithful worshiper of God. You come to church all the time. You do good things. You're a well-behaved person, perhaps a morally correct person, and have the rest of the town think you're a jerk, basically. Have the rest of the town think you're not a very nice person, not a very kind person, not a very generous person. You don't watch the wrong movies. You don't do bad things. And speaking of wrong movies, I've mentioned this show Cuties, and we got some really good news this week on Cuties. The state of Texas has indicted Netflix criminally, the corporation criminally. So nobody's going to be going to jail, I don't think, but some big fines could come out of this for the marketing of that film. So we'll see what happens there. I thought that was good news. But anyway, you can be morally correct, but if you're not generous, if you're not kind, if you're not benevolent, if you're not a good neighbor, if you don't treat your neighbors the way God has called upon it. Now, we see it through the cross, don't we? I mean, that's where when Paul David says it should flow. I think for us, that's easy to see because we see it through the cross. And we see the Old Testament through the cross. And it's kind of unavoidable. Sometimes I think it's helpful to try to see it as much as we can through the eyes of the original audience. And then try to maybe understand it through the cross, through the lens of the cross. Because they didn't see it that way. They didn't see it the way the original audience didn't think about Jesus dying on the cross when they read it. But one of the most powerful aspects of the symbol of a cross is that it is horizontal. And in a sense, it connects God to humanity. Jesus came down from God. God was here with us in a special way. But then it is also horizontal too, right? There's two beams, one vertical and one horizontal. And so we are connected to God through the cross, and that should connect us to our fellow human beings. And that's something that we kind of maybe take for granted because of the example of Jesus, because of how Jesus treats people and how he heals people. And we looked at Sunday, and how he has compassion on them, how he feeds them when they're hungry, how much care, how he weeps when his friend Lazarus dies. We see Jesus's heart is very much for the people. And hopefully we have that same heart. It can be difficult sometimes, can it? It's difficult to look at maybe angry mobs rioting in a city and have a heart of compassion for those people. I think Jesus could. And he did. And if we can't now, perhaps we can set that as something we can grow towards. If I just can't have compassion upon someone, and many other bad things that happen, so many things that happen that put people in PD's place of business, it's hard to feel sorry for them all the time when they end up there. But Jesus had compassion on them, served them, died for them too. They need to accept his sacrifice. They need to receive it into their lives. But so Abraham, getting back to him, Abimelech doesn't trust him, and for good reason. Trusting Abraham has been an expensive proposition for Abimelech already. So he wants to get a clear agreement worked out, a covenant, and Abraham enters into it and is faithful to the covenant. One thing about Abraham is he's faithful to covenants. He's faithful to God's covenant. He's faithful to Abimelech's covenant. Before, he didn't have a covenant. Before, he's just a man traveling through the land with a really good-looking older wife. And now he's a faithful covenant partner with Abimelech. And we will see this name and this place. It comes up from time to time in the Old Testament, and he's an important character, and Abraham is in a covenant with him, but he's a Philistine too, so we know the Philistines are not exactly the best friends of the Jews throughout their history either. So, who was the starting center on the Philistine basketball team? Does anybody know?
Wyatt.
Yeah. We would post Mark up on him, but I think Mark would have a hard time. I mean, he's like, 8 feet tall or something like that?
I got him right out here one day.
You got him, huh?
No, he got me.
Oh. I thought maybe you took him outside and drained some jumpers on him or something.
We had a vacation Bible school skit where I was Goliath and I forgot who was David. He cut my head off with my own sword.
Yeah, but then David reached down and picked up Goliath's head by its hair and held it up. I mean, how did they do that?
Wait, it was when I had hair, okay?
Okay. So this was in the 1940s. Okay.
Preachers got the best one.
Mindy says, hello, everybody. So we're glad Mindy's here. So Mindy's doing good. She's at home. She's being a good girl, Darius and Ann. So you may not have to give her a whipping when you get home tonight. So that's good. Any other thoughts on this? Okay, we got through that a little bit more quickly than I thought. Let's go on into Genesis 22 and talk about a plot twist. We'll just look at verses 1 through 8 tonight. So we are now officially in Genesis 22, looking at verses 1 through 8. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am, excuse me. I was thinking of Samuel, I guess. He said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham arose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took two of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the third day, 3 days, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took his in his hand the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. How many people, when they got in trouble when they were a little kid, had to go cut their own switch? You didn't have to carry the wood that you were going to get cooked over, did you?
Wouldn't be too good. Be a little concerning, but
What do we think?
Well, obviously Isaac's aware something's missing from this recipe.
But why a 3-day journey?
That's where he was sent, from where he was anyway. In 3 days, the Bible has these repeating themes in it. They came up over and over again.
So Rick can make a point that there was just 3.
the thing, one of the things is that Abraham seemed to accept it rather meekly, or, "Yes, Lord, let's go do her," and he didn't question or argue or anything, which is a little bit hard to understand.
It's Abraham is almost, I think you could almost say he's bipolar in his faith. I mean, when it's really strong, it's amazing. And then at times he's really weak in faith, and he, lies about who Sarah is.
Well, he does say in verse 5, we will return to you. So he tells his servants, he said, the 2 guys he left behind, he said, we'll return to you. And so, I'm like you, but he somehow understands that Isaac, or at least he says that he's.
Yeah.
In the back of his mind, he's thinking something will happen, but he don't know what.
Well, the writer of Hebrews says he gives him the credit for thinking he would be resurrect Isaac, even though we haven't had a resurrection yet in the history of the Bible. As we've gone through this as a narrative of God's people, there have been no resurrections yet. But he has faith that somehow or other that this will be, and he seems to believe that it will ultimately be a lamb or a sheep, something offered. God will provide it. But he
raises his hand to trust him. I mean, so he's accepting the fact that he's going to have to kill him. He just don't know how it's going to work out, but he figures God will take care of it.
He, in a sense, Isaac is dead as soon as God issues the command. That's how accepting of God, of the request that God made to Abraham. That's how accepting Abraham was. When God says kill Isaac, Isaac is effectively, in a way, he's dead. He's a dead man walking, dead boy walking. He's not. I mean, that's his dad's going to sacrifice him. It's just going to happen. So, in a sense, even though Isaac's life never ends here in the story, in a sense, it's over. What does that teach us about faith? What faith is?
That would be tough faith. You know. I was thinking of something else before you said that, and completely fouled me up.
That's a good thing then, probably.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought.
Very good.
Mr. Kelso, did you raise your hand?
Well, I was gonna comment on verse 5 also, but I think you more or less covered it. But when I first read it, I was thinking, okay, is Abraham kind of telling a little fib there, or is he, just so Isaac won't get too worried about what's happening, or did he really have a strong faith that this deed was going to be removed from him? He wasn't going to have to follow through.
Once again, it's knowing how the outcome of the story, and the writer of Hebrews certainly knew the story. Looking back at it, we say it's a great statement of faith. His belief that he would return, that God would deliver Isaac or resurrect him from the dead. In fact, in a way he did. But when you're going through the story again, if you can look at it for the very first time, I mean, one of my favorite movies of all time is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And that movie, when it came out, like 60 years ago now, I think it was in 1960, but it might be a little bit newer than that. But it changed how people go to the movies. People used to kind of go in whenever they got there, sit down, watch it, then watch it till it came back around to where they came in, and maybe even stay and watch it again or whatever. For one thing, the theaters, a lot of them had air conditioning when their homes didn't, so they would soak up that air conditioning, I think. But Hitchcock wanted the theater owners to only let people see it from start to finish, and that's it. And then when you leave, don't talk about it after you leave. Because there's only one big star in that movie, and that's Vivian Leigh. Norman Bates guy, Anthony Perkins, was not a big star. He had a decent career, but he was not a big star going in that movie. Vivian Leigh is the star, and Vivian Leigh gets killed about halfway through it. That had never happened in a major Hollywood. Everybody thought she has this moment of repentance. She's going to take the money back. She's going to face the music. She's kind of come to Jesus in this hotel room, and everybody thinks, okay, let's see how this works out. And it doesn't work out too well for Vivian Leigh, does it? God does not deliver her. Marion Crane, I guess, was her name. And Norman comes in, and that's the end of Marion Crane. Now we know he's dressed up as his mother, right? So we think it's his mother. So it kind of changed. It's a surprise in the story. Going through this the first time, it has taken so long for Isaac to appear, and it come at such a cost. It has even cost, in a sense, Abraham's other son. Take your son Isaac, your only son. Ishmael is, in a sense, no longer Abraham's son because he's not living with Abraham anymore. God is paying Abraham's child support in this, I guess you could say. But Ishmael has been sent away. Take your son. This is the one you were waiting on. This is the one you were promised. This is the one you laughed. You thought it was never coming. This is the one Sarah laughed, never thought was coming. You cannot tell Sarah what's going to happen to Isaac when he... Sarah, after the birth, really kind of disappears. This is your son. This is your only son. But Abraham answers the call. He answers the call in faith to begin with. Abraham, here I am. Isaac says, my father, and Abraham says, here I am. Later on, an angel will call to him, and he will say, here I am. Each time, Abraham answers the call. What does God think about child sacrifice?
He's against it.
What's that?
He's against it.
He's against it. Very strongly against it, isn't it? It's an abomination.
This is a set. Abraham got set up. That's what happened.
You can't cheat an honest man, they say.
He got set up with this deal. It's amazing to me that Abraham said, "Well, Lord, he's the child you promised me that was going to make a nation of many."
Isaac will be your heir.
Right.
Mhm.
And whatnot, and yet there's no question whatever, he just picked up, saddled his donkey and away he went. You know?
To do something that God hates. I mean, one of the justifications for driving the Canaanites out of the land of Canaan on Israel's behalf is that the Canaanites practiced child sacrifice. They made their children pass through the fire. They practiced child sacrifice. It's a good thing we don't practice child sacrifice in America these days. Huh?
I think it's, in this, and for years, I always thought, you know what? Isaac must have been terrified. In some ways, you think of that whole situation of what went on. And, when you see your father with that knife up there, it's like, I can't imagine what's going through his mind. However,
You think when he starts getting tied up, that might be a sign that something's going horribly wrong.
and as it all played out, with his hand being stopped by the angel, with there being a ram in the thicket, it turned out to be a perfect example of faith for Isaac. His life to be a part of experiencing the faith that his father had.
Mm-hmm. We're getting into next week already, but that's okay. But I'd like to talk, and we got 6 minutes left. Think about, we see the Bible so often through a lens of morality, of what's right and what's wrong and how we should live and all of that. I don't think any of you should bound up your child and take them out to sacrifice them, hoping on the fact that God will, tie a lamb up or a ram up by his horns in the thicket, and that way you don't have to. But God here calls for something he normally despises. But in terms of child sacrifice, what is Jesus' death on the cross for God? When Lot offers his daughters to the men of Sodom, and one thing I think we could take from it, and I'm not trying to tell you to think radically differently about your family, perhaps, but a lot of people they'll say they'll do anything for their kids. I would do anything, and I've talked to a lady not too long ago who had gone to kind of extraordinary lengths to help her daughter. Didn't work out, and I just told her, well, you'll do anything for your kids. Try. And that's understandable. And I think that's a God-given feeling about that. I'm very happy to have a great nephew. I don't think my joy about it is even comparable to the joy that baby's parents feel right now. And probably not comparable to the joy the grandparents, whether my parents or the great-grandparents feel about it. It's just really neat for me, but then so far I've managed to avoid changing any diapers, and I plan on keeping doing that. So I don't have quite the investment in this. But in terms of the strangeness of the story, also, we may look at it and think, well, he can feel comfortable and safe being with his father, being alone with his father. In that ancient culture, the men just didn't have that much to do with the kids. Here's a boy, maybe for the first time, really being alone with his father. My mom wanted our dad to take us fishing and spend some time with us, do stuff with just the boys, and preferably at times just one boy at a time. Have each son have a time alone with his dad. And that's a very healthy agenda, I think. But it just wasn't in that culture a real common thing. The women took care of there were the women and children, and then the men.
But apparently when the man spoke, the kids didn't argue about it.
The emotional distance may have helped create the sense of reverence for the father, that they were, dad's not telling you every little thing to do every day. So that's your mom's job in this culture. And so when dad does speak, it's usually probably about something big, and it does probably command, this is it. There's no appeal. Mom tells you to do something you don't want to do, you can appeal to dad. And there's no appeal. There's no higher court in this culture. So there's really a lot going on, and it's a very important story. It's a very challenging story. I mean, Abraham's meekness, and we think, even now, I think a lot of times we think of meekness as a bad thing, as a vice, and it's really biblically presented as a virtue. There was a book written by a guy named William Bennett several years ago, the Book of American Virtues. He's a compulsive gambler. I don't think gambling is one of American, I'm not sure, but I haven't read the book, but I doubt humility and meekness are considered great American virtues. Courage, independence, all that stuff, those are American virtues. Abraham, the faith of our father of our faith, is meek. He's meek and lowly in heart. And he takes this commandment from God, and he's going to obey it completely without questioning whether he's thought as it happens that this is going to turn out okay, or whether it turning out okay and we seeing his obedience and looking back on it, we credit him, we reckon it as faith. It doesn't really matter in a sense, because it is faith, because God reckons it as faith. God reckons it as righteousness. But God is asking him to do something horrible. But there is a season for everything under heaven. And there's a time and a place, and there's even a time and a place for child sacrifice to some extent, in a certain way of looking at it. And I guess what I would, in our last couple minutes, like to leave you with is this thought. Like you said, like I said, most people will do anything for their kids. Their kids are the number one priority in their life. Think about what you can do for others, and maybe sometimes it will come at the expense of your kids. I think biblically we can look at this and say, yes, we have a duty and an honor to care for our children. We do not have a duty and an honor to indulge them in every single thing they desire. There's nothing more biblically appropriate than to tell a teenager, no. You don't have to get them the brand new iPhone. You don't have to stand outside the Apple store to get them the brand new iPhone. They don't have to go to every concert. They don't have to go to every game. They don't have to do everything they want to do. You need to care for them. But caring for them doesn't relieve you of the obligation to care for other people either. Abraham cares for his children, but he cares for others as well. He enters into a covenant with others intentionally. And Isaac has been cared for. Isaac will be cared for. But he's still a neighbor. He's not just a father, he's a neighbor. So take care of your kids. Don't kill them. They may have it coming. I'm not saying they don't have it coming, but don't give it to them. Don't kill them. But you don't have to give them everything else either. And taking care of your kids does not relieve you of your obligation to other people in the world. Abraham is making a statement to the world here, whether he knows it or not. He's making a statement to the world. And the statement is, God is even more important than my children. I love my children more than anything in the world, but I love God more than anything in the world, including my children. Yes, sir. I'll let Robert have the last word here.
As you talk about that, you putting God on me, Sarah had absolutely no trouble, according to the story.
She's not a part of the story.
She's not a part of the story at all. It's kind of fascinating if you start to really think about the part she plays up with.
She's absolutely indispensable.
Yeah, she's a part of the story, but in this part here, it is absolutely Abraham, Isaac, and God. Sarah's so it kind of shows you again the type of society and the type of relationships. You don't have to put her down, just say that's what it was.
And when people look at this and see maybe toxic masculinity, father, son, no mother, it's not like it's not there. I mean, it's not like it's not, this is an all male story. And,
Point in time, prior to that, even after that, but right there, that's interesting, and you almost have to stop and take a step back, because we tend to look at the family as a unit, and we don't see today that type of relationship.
and we might think of a loving father who has a loving mother, and they talked about it and they agreed and they were,
To make a decision.
that is not presented in the story. It's not in the story. It may have happened, but it's not in the story. In the story, Abraham is called, Abraham acts. He doesn't check with his wife first. Guys, you better check with your wife first before you make a big decision. I promise you, you want to check with your wife. Yeah.
Well, it just kind of struck me how there's no part here. This is Abraham, God, Isaac, Sarah is not a part of this particular item.
Thank you, Robert, and everybody for your comments and thoughts. We are slightly over our time, so we will sign off, and we will be dismissed in prayer by